Your brain has a very unusual feature. It consists of two nearly identical hemispheres, the right and the left. Scientists have long been intrigued by why the brain has this seemingly unnecessary redundancy, as it can function even with one hemisphere missing. No machine can boast such a quality. Moreover, if each hemisphere possesses its own consciousness, does this mean that each of us has two independent centers of consciousness in our heads? In 1981, Dr. Roger Sperry received the Nobel Prize for demonstrating that the brain's hemispheres are not exact mirror images of each other, but perform separate and distinct functions. This discovery caused a sensation in neurology. If we attempt to understand it, as we will in this video, your perspective on your own consciousness might fundamentally change. In 1848, Phineas Gage worked as a railway construction foreman and was the victim of an unfortunate accident. A meter-long iron rod was propelled through his head by an unexpected dynamite explosion, passing through the top of his skull and landing 25 meters behind him. His colleagues, shocked by the event, immediately called for a doctor. Miraculously, Gage survived. In the weeks following, Gage was in a confused state, but eventually he fully recovered. However, his colleagues noticed after the accident, his personality and behavior changed drastically. Gage, previously cheerful and friendly, became irritable, rude, and selfish. Women were advised to stay away from him. Dr. John Harlow, who attended to Gage shortly after the accident, noticed that he became capricious and vacillating, constantly devising plans and, having barely started them, abandoning them for others. He was a child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations, yet possessed the animal passions of a strong man. Dr. Harlow also highlighted the radical changes in Gage's personality, and colleagues even said he was no longer like his former self.
An animal now.
An animal's emotions in a man's body.
After Gage's death in 1860, Dr. Harlow preserved his skull and the iron rod that had pierced it. Later, X-ray analysis of the skull revealed that the rod caused significant damage to the frontal lobe of the brain in both hemispheres.
Look at yourself, Phineas. Give me my job back! You give me my job back!
This unusual case not only determined the fate of Phineas Gage, but was also destined to change the course of science. Previously, scientists mostly held a dualistic view of the brain and soul as two separate entities. However, after it became clear that damage to the frontal lobe leads to radical changes in personality, a revision of the scientific paradigm was required. Scientists concluded that specific brain regions are associated with specific types of behavior. In 1861, a year after Phineas Gage's death, the concept of the brain-behavior connection received further validation through the work of Parisian physician Pierre-Paul Broca. Broca described a patient who appeared entirely normal, except for one thing: he had a severe speech impairment. The patient understood spoken language well, but was only able to produce a single sound, resembling the twang of a string. After the patient's death, Broca discovered that his left temporal lobe was damaged. Broca observed 12 similar cases, allowing him to formulate the concept of Broca's aphasia, characterizing patients with an understanding of speech but a loss of the ability to speak. During the Second Schleswig War of 1864, German physician Gustav Fritsch, attending to soldiers with open brain wounds, noticed that touching one of the hemispheres caused convulsions on the opposite side of the body. He showed that different brain hemispheres control opposite sides of the body and proved the electrical nature of brain activity. Interestingly, the first attempts to affect the brain with electricity were made by the Romans about 2,000 years ago. According to historical records, in 43 AD, the personal physician of Emperor Claudius applied an electric ray to the head of a patient suffering from severe headaches. In the 1930s, Dr. William Penfield, during surgeries on the brains of patients with epilepsy, discovered that stimulation of certain brain areas triggers reactions in various parts of the body. He was able to match the brain areas to different body functions with such accuracy that his maps are still used, almost unchanged. Penfield also found that stimulation of the temporal lobe induces vivid memories of long past events in patients. He was shocked when during a brain operation, a patient suddenly exclaimed, "I feel like..." I was standing at the school door. I heard my mom talking on the phone with my aunt, inviting her to come over in the evening. Penfield realized he was touching memories buried deep inside the brain. The results he published in 1951 significantly changed the understanding of how the brain works. By the mid-20th century, it became possible to create a basic map of the brain, delineating its zones and defining the functions of many of them. For example, the neocortex, or the new cortex of the brain, represents the outer layer of the cerebral hemispheres and is divided into 4 lobes. Our neocortex is particularly well developed because its main function is the reception and processing of sensory information from the senses, except for the frontal lobe, which is located under the frontal bone. The prefrontal cortex, which is part of the frontal lobe, plays a key role in the formation of rational thinking. The information you are perceiving right now while watching this video is processed precisely in the prefrontal cortex. Damage to this part of the brain can negatively affect the ability to plan and predict the future, as happened with Phineas Gage. The parietal lobe is located at the top of the brain and is associated with processing sensory information, including spatial perception, navigation, and coordination of movements. The right hemisphere controls attention and body coordination, while the left hemisphere controls fine movements and some aspects of speech. Disorders in this area can lead to various problems, including difficulties in recognizing parts of one's own body. The occipital lobe, located at the back of the brain, deals with processing visual information from the eyes. Damage to this area can cause blindness and other visual impairments. The temporal lobe is responsible for speech, as well as visual recognition of faces and experiencing some emotions. Damage to this lobe can lead to loss of speech and the inability to recognize faces familiar to you. The human brain resembles a museum, storing remnants of all stages of human evolution over millions of years, during which the brain dramatically increased in size and expanded its functionality. Interestingly, an infant's brain after birth goes through a similar path, growing in a way that mimics the stages of human evolution. Dr. Roger Sperry, mentioned at the beginning of the video, worked for many years on the treatment of epilepsy and studied in detail cases where seizures were caused by a disruption in the interaction between the hemispheres. He conducted surgeries in which he cut the corpus callosum connecting the hemispheres, leading to the cessation of seizures. Patients with split brains appeared normal at first glance, but further observation revealed very strange consequences. Normally, thoughts in our brain freely move between hemispheres, where the left is prone to logical analysis and speech skills, and the right to creative thinking and artistry. However, when the connection between the hemispheres is severed, the right can start acting independently, contrary to the desires of the dominant left. This leads to a situation where 2 separate wills coexist in one body, sometimes conflicting with each other for control over the body. A creepy situation arises when the left hand, under control of the right hemisphere, begins to act independently of the owner's wishes, as if it were alien. In one case, for example, a man intended to hug his wife, but while one hand carried out this intention, the other had completely different plans. It struck his wife in the face. Another documented case involved a woman trying to pick up a specific item, like a dress, but her other hand reached for a completely different item. And one man even developed a real phobia. He was afraid to sleep at night, fearing his uncontrollable hand might strangle him. People with split brains sometimes felt as though they were inside a cartoon where, according to the script, one hand tries to subdue the other. Sometimes doctors compare this condition to Dr. Strangelove syndrome, recalling a scene from the movie by Stanley Kubrick where the characters' hands conflict with each other. After carefully studying cases with split brains, Dr. Sperry concluded that 2 independent consciousnesses could indeed coexist in one head. He wrote, "Each hemisphere is indeed an independent system of consciousness, capable of perceiving external signals, thinking, remembering, reasoning, desiring, and feeling, all at a perfectly human level. And both hemispheres can think simultaneously, experiencing different, even conflicting mental states, which develop in parallel." What the? How? Why do we have 2 consciousnesses in our skull? Why? The stories of patients with split brains amazed me so much that I decided to dive into the problem of consciousness. This video was inspired by the book The Future of the Mind by theoretical physicist Michio Kaku and Who's in Charge? Free Will and the Science of the Brain by Dr. Michael Gazzaniga. Conduct a scientific experiment. Hit like if this topic sparked interest in your consciousness. And by the end of the video, you'll understand the second reason why I just couldn't ignore this topic. Because attention to the problem and answers are needed not sometime in the future, but now. In Rupert Glasgow's book, Minimal Self and the Origin of Consciousness, which is mentioned in the Engaging Consciousness videos by the Kurzgesagt channel, the origin and evolution of consciousness are succinctly described. In my opinion, from the dawn of time, life on Earth evolved from simple molecules to complex organisms possessing consciousness. Initially, life was a complex molecule encoded with information about its environment. These molecules, thanks to external energy, organized themselves, creating a conformation, a unique three-dimensional arrangement of atoms. This was the first step toward life as we understand it. According to the RNA world theory, life on Earth could have started with RNA molecules capable of self-replication. In conditions presumably existing on early Earth, simple nucleotides could randomly combine, forming RNA molecules with various sequences. In other words, in the supposed nucleotide pool, basic RNA elements could randomly come together, creating diverse molecular combinations. These RNA molecules didn't just randomly combine, creating diverse sequences, but also possessed special catalytic properties. These properties allow them to perform something quite unique and critically important for the emergence of life. They could ensure the process of their own reproduction. Imagine a scenario where in the primordial soup of nucleotides that compose the nascent Earth, various RNA chains spontaneously formed. Among this molecular diversity, some chains were special. These unique RNA molecules didn't just exist as passive chains. They were capable of actively influencing the chemical reactions around them. This means they could not only accelerate, but also direct the process of creating new copies of themselves from surrounding nucleotides. This self-replication process was key as it represented an early form of biological evolution. RNA molecules that were more efficient at self-reproduction had a better chance of surviving and accumulating in this primordial biochemical environment. This laid the foundation for the emergence of more complex molecular structures and ultimately for the appearance of life in all its diversity. Thus, these catalytically active RNA molecules could play a crucial role in the birth and evolution of life on Earth, representing the primary building blocks of biological systems. Interestingly, Rupert Glasgow attributes a sort of ego to these molecules. These molecules strive to capture as many resources as possible for their own replication, which is a primitive analog of sexual attraction in modern organisms, the desire to spread one's genetic information. Over time, through mutations and natural selection, organisms with new abilities appeared, for example, with motors for movement or sensors for environmental perception. These primitive organisms began to react to external stimuli, for instance, slowing down when detecting food and speeding up in its absence. According to Glasgow, consciousness is any behavioral strategy that optimally allocates resources. The emergence of the first sensor can be considered the initial form of consciousness. With the appearance of a second sensor, the organism began to navigate space based on external conditions, gradients. For instance, the creation of the first protein capable of absorbing light. Rhodopsin marks the emergence of primitive vision. The organism began to perceive the external world and move towards sources of light and heat. The appearance of light-sensitive cells and the subsequent development of the eye allowed the organism to construct a more complex picture of the world. Over time, the development of the eye and other sensory organs enabled organisms to create more complex models of reality in their brains. They began to understand and interpret what was happening around them, which is a sign of a more advanced consciousness. A key thesis of the book is that consciousness is a gradual development, starting from basic survival strategies and evolving into complex forms of thinking. Glasgow emphasizes that consciousness is not something fixed, but rather a constantly evolving process. Towards the end of the book, he makes a grand conclusion. The development of consciousness is not just a biological process, but also a fundamental aspect of the evolution of life. But why is it fundamental? What does modern physics say about the problem of consciousness, and how does it attempt to research and describe it? The concept of consciousness has occupied philosophers for centuries, but has stubbornly resisted, and still resists. A simple definition: philosopher David Chalmers gathered data from more than 20,000 works dedicated to this topic and concluded that no other field has seen so many efforts of so many scientists yield so little in terms of common, universally accepted assertions. The 17th century philosopher Gottfried Leibniz once wrote, "If it were possible to enlarge the brain to the size of a mill and walk about inside it, consciousness would not be found there." Some skeptics doubt that a theory of consciousness is viable, arguing that understanding consciousness is impossible, since no object can comprehend itself. The renowned Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker notes, "We can't see ultraviolet light. We can't mentally rotate an object in the fourth dimension. It's not out of the question that we also can't solve puzzles like free will or the spiritual life." Moreover, for a significant part of the 20th century, behaviorism, which denied the importance of consciousness, dominated among psychological theories. This concept was based on the premise that only the objective manifestations of behavior of animals and humans were worthy of study, as opposed to subjective inner states of mind. Some researchers, having lost hope of defining consciousness, focused on its description. Psychiatrist Giulio Tononi expressed it this way: "Everyone knows what consciousness is. It's what leaves you every night when you fall asleep without dreaming, and returns in the morning when you wake up." Consciousness has remained a subject of discussion and debate for centuries, yet surprisingly few conclusions have been drawn. Considering that physicists have made significant contributions to the science of the brain thanks to the creation of many new devices, perhaps it's time to follow their lead and rethink this ancient question anew. When a physicist tackles a mystery, their first step is to gather data, after which they develop a model or a simplified representation of the subject being studied, showcasing its key characteristics. In physics, a model is characterized by various parameters, for example, temperature, energy, time. Using this model, the physicist simulates the future development of the subject. Today's largest supercomputers are used precisely for modeling the development of systems that can cover protons, nuclear reactions, weather conditions, the Big Bang, and the dynamics of black holes. After numerous calculations and experiments based on the model, a new, more advanced model with more complex parameters is created. For example, Isaac Newton, in the process of studying the motion of the moon, developed a simple model that later played a revolutionary role in human history. He imagined throwing an apple. In doing so, he reasoned that the faster the apple moves, the further it will fly. And if the apple is thrown with sufficient speed, it will orbit around the Earth and return to its starting point. Thus, Newton claimed that his model explains the motion of any objects. Hence, the forces controlling an apple flying around the Earth are identical to the forces controlling the motion of the moon. However, this model itself is incomplete. The breakthrough was achieved when Newton was able to use his theory to model the future, that is, to determine the positions of moving objects. To solve this complex task, he had to develop a new area of mathematics known as integral calculus. With its help, Newton predicted the future trajectory of not only the moon, but also Halley's Comet, as well as other planets. Since then, Newton's laws have been used to calculate the trajectories of a wide variety of moving objects, from cannonballs, cars, and rockets to asteroids, stars, and galaxies. The accuracy of a model is determined by its ability to precisely reproduce the key characteristics of the original system. In this case, the main parameter was the position of the apple and the moon in space and time. By allowing this parameter to change, Newton could observe the motion of the bodies over time, which became one of the most significant discoveries in the history of physics. Any model is valuable until it is replaced by a more accurate model that better reflects the system's parameters. Albert Einstein proposed his model based on a new parameter, the curvature of space-time, instead of Newton's model of forces acting upon the apple and the moon. In his model, The apple moves not because of Earth's gravitational force, but because Earth deforms the fabric of space-time, and the apple simply follows the surface of this curved space. From this, Einstein modeled the future of the universe. Today, scientists using powerful computers can calculate this model far into the future, creating impressive images of black hole collisions. Michio Kaku, in his book The Future of the Mind, suggests applying this basic strategy in developing a new theory of consciousness. He analyzed definitions of consciousness proposed in neurology and biology, attempting to form his own definition, which resulted in the following statement: consciousness is the process of creating a model of the world using a multitude of feedback loops across different parameters, such as temperature, position in space, time, and relation to surroundings, with the aim of achieving certain goals, for example, finding a mate, food, shelter. He called this the space-time theory of consciousness, because this definition emphasizes that animals formed their model of the world in the context of space and relationships with their kind, while humans expand their model to include the temporal aspect, both future and past. Thus, the most elementary level of consciousness, or level 0, arises in organisms with limited mobility or none at all. Such creatures create their worldview using feedback loops based on a few parameters, such as temperature. An example of the most primitive level of consciousness can be a thermostat, which automatically controls the operation of an air conditioner or heater to maintain a set temperature in a room. The main characteristic of such a system is the feedback loop that activates the device when it becomes too hot or too cold in the room. Each of these feedback loops is considered one unit of consciousness. The mentioned thermostat would have one unit of consciousness at level 0, that is, level 0 to 1. This approach allows any consciousness to be defined based on the number and complexity of feedback loops. In this context, consciousness ceases to be an undefined set of abstract concepts, forming a hierarchical system that can be quantitatively assessed. For example, a bacterium or plant possessing a large number of feedback loops would have more developed consciousness at level 0. Thus, a plant responding to 10 different parameters, temperature, humidity, sunlight, gravity, etc., would have a consciousness level of 0 to 10. Mobile organisms with a central nervous system possess consciousness at level 1. This level includes an additional set of parameters allowing for tracking of current position in space. An example of level 1 consciousness is reptiles, which have so many feedback loops that a central nervous system is required to manage them. The brain of a reptile includes roughly 100 or more such loops, responsible for smell, coordination, touch, hearing, vision, blood pressure, and more, each of which also has internal feedback loops. For example, the visual system involves many feedback loops, as the eye can recognize color, movement, shape, light intensity, and shadow. Similarly, other reptilian senses, such as hearing or taste, require additional feedback loops. All these loops together form a mental model of the world and the reptile's place in it, as well as the place of other animals, especially potential prey. Interestingly, in humans, level 1 consciousness is largely managed by the reptilian brain, located in the central and back part of the head. At the next level, level 2 consciousness, an organism forms a model of its position not only in space, but also in a social context. This is particularly characteristic of social animals that possess emotions. The number of feedback loops at level 2 increases exponentially, making it logical to introduce a new quantitative classification for this type of consciousness. Such complex behavioral patterns as seeking allies, recognizing enemies, serving as alpha male, etc., require the presence of a highly developed brain. The development of level 2 consciousness coincides with the formation of new brain structures such as the limbic system. The limbic system includes the hypothalamus, responsible for memory, amygdala for emotions, and thalamus for sensory information, each processing new parameters for modeling social relationships. Thus, the number and type of feedback loops change. We define the sophistication of level 2 consciousness as the total number of individual feedback loops necessary for an animal to socially interact with other members of its group. Unfortunately, there is very little research on animal consciousness, and not all forms of social interactions within a group have been studied.
What's this made of?
Rock.
What's this made of?
Glass.
What am I doing?
Water.
However, for an approximate assessment of the development of Level 2 consciousness, we can consider the number of individuals in a group and add to this all ways of emotional communication between animals, such as the ability to recognize friends and competitors, friendship, mutual assistance, support, awareness of one's own status, and the status of other group members, and so on. Insects are an exception here, as despite their complex social structure, they lack emotions. Due to the limited empirical data on animal behavior, we can only approximately estimate the numerical value of Level 2 consciousness by listing emotions and variants of social behavior in specific animal species. For example, if there are 10 individuals in a wolf pack, and each wolf interacts with each comrade in 25 different ways, that is, with 25 different emotions and behavioral responses, then the level of consciousness of each wolf in this approximation equals 250. Defining the boundaries of consciousness in such a way, we come to the conclusion that Homo sapiens does not possess some unique quality. There are many types of consciousness. As Charles Darwin once said, "The difference between man and the higher animals, though considerable, is one of degree, not of kind." However, what distinguishes human consciousness from that of animals? Humans are the only creatures among animals who understand the concept of tomorrow. Unlike animals, humans constantly ask themselves, "What if?" Forecasting the future, weeks, months, and even years ahead. Michio Kaku believes that Level 3 consciousness forms a model of its position in the world and then makes predictions about the future based on more or less accurate assumptions. This can be briefly formulated as follows. Human consciousness is a specific form of consciousness that creates a model of the world and then simulates its behavior over time, evaluating the past and modeling the future based on it. This requires averaging and evaluating a multitude of feedback loops with a goal of making a decision and achieving an objective. By the time we reach Level 3 consciousness, our brain forms so many feedback loops that it requires a kind of CEO who would select the information needed for predicting the future and make final decisions. In this aspect, our brain differs from that of other animals, especially thanks to the specifically developed prefrontal cortex, which allows us to visualize the future. Quoting Harvard psychologist Dr. Daniel Gilbert, "The greatest achievement of the human brain is its ability to imagine objects and episodes that do not exist in reality, and it is precisely this ability that allows us to think about the future. The human brain is a prediction machine, and creating the future is the most important thing it does. With brain scanning methods, we can speculate on which part of the brain future modeling occurs." Renowned scientist Michael Gazzaniga, one of the world's leading experts in neurobiology and neuropsychology, notes that Area 10, the internal granular layer 4 in the lateral part of the prefrontal cortex in humans, is almost twice as large as in anthropoid apes. Area 10 is associated with memory and planning, cognitive flexibility, abstract thinking, activating appropriate behavioral schemes and inhibiting inappropriate ones, assimilating rules, and selecting the necessary information from the mass of data received from the senses. While some animals are well-oriented in space and aware of themselves in relation to their kin, it remains unclear whether they can plan for the future and have a concept of tomorrow. Most animals, even social ones with a highly developed limbic system, respond to situation, that is, the presence of predators or potential mates, mainly instinctively rather than planning their future. Mammals do not consciously prepare for hibernation. When the temperature begins to drop, they follow their instinct. Hibernation is regulated by the corresponding feedback loop, and consciousness is based on sensory data. Predators that use cunning and camouflage to hunt plan future actions, but their plans are limited by instincts and the timing of the hunt. Primates are capable of intrigue and developing short-term plans, that is, when searching for food, but there is no evidence that they can plan for a period exceeding a few hours. Humans are a different case. Although in many situations we rely on instincts and emotions, we also constantly analyze and evaluate incoming information through numerous feedback loops. We are able to predict future events, sometimes even thousands of years into the future. The primary goal of modeling is to assess possible options and select the optimal solution for achieving a set goal. All these processes occur in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which enables us to model the future and assess our own capabilities for choosing the best path to achieve our goal. This skill evolved in us through evolution for several reasons. Firstly, the ability to foresee the future brings significant evolutionary advantages, such as avoiding predators, finding food, and a mate. Secondly, it allows the consideration of multiple future scenarios and selecting the most suitable one. Thirdly, as we move from level 1 to levels 2 and 3, the number of feedback loops increases exponentially, requiring a unified control center to evaluate all these diverse and competing signals. This is necessary because instinct alone is insufficient for analyzing each of the many feedback loops. It is precisely such a control center that distinguishes human consciousness from that of animals. This can be seen in a simple experiment. Neurobiologist and Stanford neurology professor David Eagleman described a scenario where a male stickleback fish is placed in an aquarium with a female. The male hesitates between the desire to mate and the desire to defend its territory, leading to confusion. It simultaneously begins courtship and attacks the female. A similar picture can be observed in mice. If an electrode is placed in front of a piece of cheese, the mouse's approach to the cheese will be accompanied by an electric shock. One feedback loop suggests that the mouse eat the cheese, another to avoid approaching the cheese due to the danger of electric shock. By adjusting the placement of the electrode, it's possible to make the mouse hesitate between the two opposing signals. In a situation where a human's CEO of the brain is activated, capable of evaluating all pros and cons and making a balanced decision, the mouse, facing two conflicting signals, helplessly flits back and forth. This is reminiscent of the parable of Buridan's ass, who died of hunger between two identical managers. But how does the brain model the future? It continuously processes a huge, gigantic amount of sensory and emotional information. In this process, a key component is predicting future events by establishing cause and effect relationships. That is, determining that if event A occurs, event B will follow, possibly followed by events C and D. Any choice we make initiates a sequence of consequences, thus forming a tree of potential future scenarios with many branches. The CEO, located in the prefrontal cortex, analyzes the outcomes of each option and selects the most suitable one for making the final decision. Suppose you're contemplating robbing a bank.
That's a great plan.
How many realistic alternatives can you envision? You would have to consider numerous cause and effect chains, including police action, reactions of random witnesses, alarm systems, relationships with accomplices, road conditions, surveillance cameras, and so on. To effectively model the robbery, you would need to evaluate hundreds or even thousands of cause and effect relationships. Any theory worth considering must be testable. In the context of the space-time theory of consciousness, the task is to explain all facets of human consciousness from this perspective. I decided to rob a bank and even made a plan. But when I saw the number of surveillance cameras, I realized that a blogging career suited me better. Some may argue that humor is too abstract and variable for such analysis. We spend a lot of time having fun with friends and laughing at dog videos, seemingly unrelated to future modeling. But look closer. Usually, the essence of a joke or anecdote is determined by its last line. When we hear a joke, we involuntarily model the situation it describes, advancing the story in our minds, even if we don't realize it. Our knowledge of the physical and social world allows us to anticipate the ending, and we delight and laugh when the last phrase changes the course of events, bringing an unexpected twist. Humor makes us laugh when our model of the future is suddenly disrupted and turns into something else. This plays a crucial role in evolution, as success partly depends on our ability to correctly predict future events. Life is full of surprises, so those who can foresee unconventional scenarios have a better chance of survival. Therefore, a developed sense of humor could indicate that we are intelligent and possess level 3 consciousness. Here's an example. One person asks, "How are you feeling these days?" The other responds, "Riding a roller coaster." But it's all uphill. The listener might imagine the phrase "riding a roller coaster" to imply experiencing highs and lows, a common metaphor for emotional ups and downs. However, the speaker twists the expectation by claiming it's all uphill, suggesting a constant struggle without the anticipated downs or moments of relief, diverging from the literal ups and downs of a roller coaster. Of course, if you dissect the joke thoroughly, it loses its power as the brain has time to consider several possible interpretations. This leads to a rule known to every stand-up comic. The secret of humor lies in perfect timing. If the punchline is delivered too early, the brain doesn't have time to build a future model, and the surprise effect doesn't occur. If it is said too late, the brain manages to work through several scenarios, and the surprise effect is lost again. From this perspective, it's useful to explain everything, even seemingly trivial activities like gossiping or goofing off with friends. Imagine a reptilian alien who accidentally ends up on Earth, decides to explore the world of tabloids. They might conclude that gossiping is a primary activity of humans, and they wouldn't be too far from the truth. Gossip plays a crucial role in survival, as it helps us navigate the constantly changing and complex social world. We need to keep up with the latest news to stay informed and connected with reality. The social environment is ever-changing, and here, level 2 consciousness is actively at work. However, upon hearing an interesting piece of gossip, we start making assumptions and try to understand how this event might affect our standing in society, activating level 3 consciousness. In the past, gossip and rumors were a primary source of vital information about one's tribe, and sometimes knowing the latest news could mean the difference between life and death. Play is also an important trait of consciousness. Ask children why they love to play, and they usually say it's fun. But what does fun really mean? While playing, children often try to replicate human relationships in a simplified form. Human society is extremely complex and confusing for a developing child's mind, so children use simplified adult world models, playing doctors, teachers, superheroes, and robbers, for example. Playing allows children to experiment with a small segment of adult society and behavior, learning to model the future. Adults playing games like poker also create a mental model of the distribution of cards among players and try to extend this model into the future, considering the character and bluffing capabilities of their opponents. Chess or card games, like other gambling games, require the ability to model the future. Animals living mostly in the present play differently than humans. Young mammals like to play, but they do it more for physical development. They prepare for future confrontations, determining hierarchy rather than modeling the future. The space-time theory of consciousness can also shed light on another complicated topic: intelligence. It's said that IQ tests measure the level of intelligence, but they don't really explain what intelligence is. A cynic might say, and they'd be partially right, that an IQ test is merely a measure of how well a person can take that test. These tests are often criticized for their cultural context. However, within the new paradigm, intelligence should be defined by the complexity and completeness of an individual's ability to model the future. Therefore, for example, an experienced criminal who didn't finish school might outsmart the police in certain areas. It's believed that humans are possibly the only beings on Earth capable of functioning at various levels of consciousness. Using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, we can study which specific areas of the brain are involved in processes at each of these levels. The first level of consciousness stream for us is mainly associated with the interaction between the prefrontal cortex and the thalamus. When we slowly walk through a park, we notice the scents of plants, feel a cool breeze on our skin, see sunlight glinting on the water, and so on. Our sensory organs send signals to the spinal cord, then to the brainstem, and after, to the thalamus. The thalamus acts as a switchboard and transmitter, filtering and distributing these signals to different areas of the cerebral cortex. For example, visual impressions from the park are directed to the occipital part of the cortex, while sensations from the wind are sent to the parietal region. These signals, after being processed in the respective cortex areas, are directed to the prefrontal cortex, where we begin to become aware of all these sensations. If Level 1 consciousness helps us recreate a model of our physical position in space based on sensations, then Level 2 consciousness forms a model of our place in social hierarchy. Imagine we're going to a party where it's important to maintain contact with certain people. During the process of scanning the room for familiar faces, there's an active exchange of information between the hippocampus, where memory processing occurs, and the amygdala, responsible for emotional reactions, and the prefrontal cortex, which structures all the information. The brain automatically assigns a certain emotion to each visual perception, be it joy, fear, anger, or jealousy, and then processes this emotion in the amygdala. For instance, if you notice your enemy among the crowd from who you expect a threat, the newly formed emotion of fear is processed precisely in the amygdala. It then sends an emergency signal to the prefrontal cortex, warning of potential danger. At the same time, the endocrine system receives a command to produce adrenaline and other hormones, increasing the heart rate and preparing the body for a possible fight or flight response. But beyond the ability to recognize other people, the brain also predicts their thoughts. That is, it understands others' minds. In complex societies, the ability to accurately determine the intentions, motives, and plans of others provides a huge advantage. Understanding another person's mind allows an individual to form alliances, isolate enemies, and strengthen friendships, significantly increasing the chances of survival and continuation of the species. Some anthropologists even believe that mastering this ability was a key stage in the evolution of the brain. But how does understanding another's consciousness occur? The first data on the mechanism of this process were obtained in 1996, when 3 scientists, Giacomo Rizzolatti, Leonardo Fogassi, and Vittorio Galise, discovered mirror neurons. These neurons are activated not only when you perform an action yourself, but also when you observe someone else performing that action. Mirror neurons play a key role in the processes of empathy and compassion, as they allow us not only to replicate the complex actions of others, but also to experience the emotions that person is feeling. It is believed that these neurons were critically important in the process of human evolution, especially for the development of cooperation and community cohesion. Initially, mirror neurons were discovered in the premotor cortex of monkeys. Since then, they have been found in other areas, including the prefrontal cortex of humans. Dr. Ramachandran believes that without mirror neurons, the human brain could not have developed self-awareness. I predict that mirror neurons will do for psychology what DNA did for biology. They will provide a unifying framework and help explain a host of mental abilities that have hitherto remained mysterious and inaccessible to experiments. The highest level of consciousness, primarily characteristic of humans, is Level 3, on which we build our model of the surrounding world and predict its development in the future. To do this, we analyze our memories and model the future, combining many cause and effect relationships into a unified picture of the world. For example, being at a party and observing the faces of those present, we ask ourselves questions. How can this person help me? What consequences for me could the spreading of rumors have? Is there a threat from someone present? Similar to the case of Phineas Gage at the start of the video, there's another peculiar and highly cited case in the scientific literature of Henry Gustav Molaison, known as patient HM or the man without memory. This case created a real sensation in neurology and led to many incredible discoveries. At the very least, it helped scientists realize the importance of the hippocampus in forming memories. Imagine a person lost in a maze of time, where each day is a constant repetition of the same events. This is the story of Henry Molaison, whose life drastically changed after one unfortunate incident. At 9 years old, being an ordinary boy, he suffered a severe head injury, which resulted in debilitating seizures and fits. At 25, Henry decided to undergo a risky surgery, hoping to regain a normal life. The operation successfully freed him from the agonizing symptoms. However, another problem arose. The surgeons accidentally removed part of his hippocampus. At first, it seemed that Henry was all right, but it soon became clear that something was wrong. He couldn't remember anything. After the surgery, Henry became a living example of a man living in an eternal today. He would greet the same people several times a day, using the same expressions, as if seeing them for the first time. Everything that entered his memory was retained for only a few minutes before vanishing without a trace. Each of his days resembled the plot of Groundhog Day, but without the ability to remember the previous repetitions. HM was doomed to live the same day over and over for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, his long-term memory was almost unaffected. Henry remembered his past up to the operation, but his own reflection in the mirror shocked him. He saw himself as an old man, while in his memories, he was still 25. But even this shock quickly faded away, just like everything new that had happened to him. In some sense, HM resembled an animal with level 2 consciousness, unable to recall the recent past or model the future. Without a functioning hippocampus, the man regressed from the third level of consciousness to the second. If the space-time theory of consciousness is correct, it provides us with a precise definition of self-consciousness, avoiding vague and cyclical explanations. Thus, self-consciousness can be defined as the process of creating a model of the surrounding world and predicting the future in which you yourself are a participant. From this perspective, it can be assumed that animals also possess a certain degree of self-consciousness, since for survival and continuation of the species, any animal must have an understanding of its location, but their self-consciousness is largely limited by instincts. Most animals, when faced with a mirror, either ignore it or perceive their reflection as a threat, not realizing that it is merely a reflection of themselves. This experiment is known as the mirror test and traces back to Darwin. At the same time, some species, such as elephants, higher primates, bottlenose dolphins, orcas, and even common magpies, are capable of recognizing that the image in the mirror is themselves. Humans in this respect have significantly outpaced animals by constantly creating models of the future in their minds, where they themselves are the key actors. We continuously imagine ourselves in various scenarios, on a date, at an interview, at a new job, situations that are not determined by instincts. Stopping this process of modeling the future is extremely difficult, although there are various clever methods for doing so, such as meditation. There's likely a specialized area in the brain responsible for synthesizing signals from both hemispheres, creating a cohesive self-perception. Todd Heatherton, a psychologist from Dartmouth College, suggests that this area is located in the medial part of the prefrontal cortex. Biologist Carl Zimmer asserts that the medial prefrontal cortex plays a crucial role in forming a sense of self, similar to the hippocampus's role in memory. This area could be key to understanding how the brain integrates various memories and experiences into a single identity. If this theory is accurate, then the brain at rest, when it is idle and contemplating, should be more active than in a normal state. Todd Heatherton's research supports this, highlighting the importance of self-reflection. According to the space-time theory, consciousness is composed of many brain functions competing for perception of the surrounding world. Yet we perceive our consciousness as continuous and cohesive. Michio Gazzaniga, in his book Who's in Charge, writes, "I think the brain has a multitude of local consciousness systems, the combination of which gives rise to the consciousness we are familiar with. Although the sense of consciousness feels unified to you, it is shaped by these highly discrete systems. Whatever concept you happen to be aware of at any given moment is the one that surfaces, becoming dominant. In your brain, there's a fierce competition among different systems that vie for the chance to surface and win the prize of becoming conscious." Gazzaniga, a world-renowned expert in studying people with split brains, shows that one part of the body can act contrary to a person's wishes. He claims that the left hemisphere of such patients fabricates explanations for incomprehensible phenomena, creating a false sense of unity. To prove this thesis, he developed his own methods for testing the divided mind theory.
know left hemisphere and right hemisphere now are working independent of each other.
His methods are based on addressing each hemisphere of the brain separately, not transferring information to the other hemisphere. One such method involves using special glasses that allow showing written questions to each eye separately, thereby addressing the corresponding hemisphere. However, getting independent responses from each hemisphere is a challenge, especially since the right hemisphere is incapable of speech, as the speech center is located only in the left hemisphere. In one of Gazzaniga's experiments, he used letters from a child's game to hear the right hemisphere. Initially, he asked the patient's left hemisphere about his future plans after school, and the patient responded that he wanted to become an architect. However, when the same question was addressed to the right hemisphere, the outcome was much more interesting. The right hemisphere formed two words with the letters race car driver. Secretly, from the dominant left hemisphere, the right had entirely different plans for the future. It literally had its own opinion and consciousness. Rita Carter, a renowned English journalist and science communicator, commenting on these findings, wrote, "The possible implications of this are mind-boggling. It appears that each of us may carry inside our skull, as it were, a prisoner with its own personality, ambitions, and consciousness, distinct from the entity we consider ourselves to be. Surprisingly, the two hemispheres can even differ in matters of belief. This was demonstrated in a study by neurologist Ramachandran, who described the case of a split-brain patient. For this patient, the left hemisphere claimed to be an atheist, while the right hemisphere declared belief in God. It turns out that two different attitudes towards faith and religion can coexist within the same brain." Ramachandran continues, "If this person dies, what happens to him? Will one hemisphere go to heaven and the other to hell? I do not know how to answer this question. In some patients, when confronted with the situation where two independent units of consciousness exist in the head, the left part of the brain starts creating justifications for inexplicable phenomena. Discovering an obnoxious paradox, the brain begins to fantasize and invents an answer that explains uncomfortable facts. Dr. Gazzaniga claims this creates a false sense of unity and wholeness in us. He defines the left hemisphere as the interpreter, which always concocts something to mask inconsistency and gaps in our perception. In one of his experiments, the word red was shown exclusively to the patient's left brain hemisphere, and the word banana only to the right hemisphere. It turned out the dominant left hemisphere knew nothing about the banana. Afterwards, the participant was asked to pick up a pen with his left hand, which is controlled by the right side of the brain, and draw something. As expected, he drew a banana. Clearly, only the right side of the brain could do this, having seen the word banana, while the left side was unaware of what was shown to the right. Then the participant was asked why he drew a banana. Since only the left hemisphere possesses speech and knew nothing about the banana, the patient should have answered, "I don't know." However, he said, "This hand is more comfortable for drawing long lines." Gazzaniga believes that the left hemisphere strives to find order in chaos, creating coherent stories and fitting them into context. This helps explain why we perceive ourselves as a unified self, despite the fact that our consciousness consists of many conflicting elements. How does the competition between hemispheres and the fact that half of our brain acts as an interpreter, concocting explanations and rationalizing everything around us, relate to free will? This question is actually very important because our understanding of free will affects how we construct our lives around it. For instance, Robert Sapolsky, well known to many from his Stanford course on human biology, believes that the current criminal justice system should be abolished. When it comes to explaining human behavior, there are three perspectives. 1. Our behavior expresses our free will. 2. We do not have free will. 3. Our behavior lies somewhere between these two extremes. The first assertion, that our behavior is a direct result of our beliefs, seems far-fetched. For example, if a person has an epileptic seizure, during which they involuntarily hit someone nearby, that hit must be regarded as a deliberate action. But that's absurd. Yet, about a half a millennium ago in Europe, this was indeed a prevailing option. Today, such a viewpoint seems ludicrous to us. By revising such beliefs, we've come to a foundational principle of our civilization. It's not him, it's his illness, meaning sometimes biological factors can override what we perceive as free will. Thus, a woman stepping on your foot didn't do it on purpose, she's blind. A man who doesn't help a fallen woman isn't heartless, he simply can't bend his back due to an injury. Similarly, perceptions of responsibility for crimes have changed. For instance, between 200 and 700 years ago, animals, objects, and even corpses believed to have intentionally harmed a person could be taken to court. In 1457, a pig and her piglets were put on trial for allegedly eating a child. The pig was executed, but the piglets were freed, deemed too young to bear responsibility for their actions. It's unknown whether their brain maturity was discussed then. Most people probably adhere to the third view on this matter. We possess something in between absolute free will and its complete absence. While free will is linked to biological aspects, it also abides by the physical laws of our universe. Determinism is understood in a broad sense here, meaning we possess something akin to a soul, a bearer of free will. This ephemeral substance coexists with our physical biology, somewhat limiting it. This is usually the essence of the dualistic view on free will, also called limited free will. In 1842, Scotsman Daniel Macnaghten attempted to assassinate British Prime Minister Robert Peel, but mistakenly killed his secretary. At trial, Macnaghten claimed voices that haunted him everywhere urged him to act. According to him, they killed peace in his soul and wanted to drive him to extremity. According to contemporary psychiatry, Macnaghten suffered from a form of paranoid psychosis. Doctors deeming him insane believed his delusion was so evident that only physical isolation could prevent him from committing murder. Eventually, Macnaghten was found not guilty due to insanity and spent the rest of his days in a psychiatric hospital. The verdict caused uproar and protests, ranging from ordinary citizens to Queen Victoria. The judge had to defend his decision before Parliament, but remained firm. As a result, a decision was made to renew this case with due consideration, and along with the acquittal, a formal criterion known as the Macnaghten Rule was established. It states that a person is innocent if at the time of the crime they were under the influence of a mental disorder that prevented them from distinguishing right from wrong. This rule was also applied in the case of John Hinckley Jr., who shot Ronald Reagan in 1981. This rule embodies the essence of limited free will. People should be responsible for their actions, but sometimes bizarre psychotic circumstances prevent this. Robert Sapolsky understands limited free will in this very sense. Consider the brain with its neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters, receptors, and all its richness. Our brain has evolved under the influence of many factors: intrauterine conditions, genetics, hormones, cultural environment, parental authority, and childhood traumas. All this affects our behavior. And in The Biology of Good and Evil, Sapolsky delves into all this in detail. However, apart from all these factors, there exists, in some fortified corner of the brain, a sort of homunculus that controls a person.
Is going on inside their head?
Did you guys pick up on that?
In certain situations, like epileptic seizures or alcoholism, the homunculus encounters problems and is forced to engage in a system of recovery. In other instances, such as breathing regulation, the homunculus and the biological brain work together. However, at specific moments, the homunculus independently makes decisions, analyzing all available information and considering various factors. And there it sits, inside the brain, commanding your belief and making decisions independent of physical laws. Sapolsky writes, "This is the essence of the concept of limited free will. I've seen incredibly smart people who tried to dispute the extremes of this concept instead of accepting its plausible basis. You plant this dummy in my head because you think I can freely choose how to act, provided there's no brain disease present. But no. Free will for me is something more malleable. It skims the edge of the biological, like in those cases when I choose which socks to wear today. However, in reality, neither the frequency nor the degree of manifestations of free will matter. Even if we accept that 99.99% of all your actions are biologically predetermined and only once in 10 years does free will kick in, allowing you to brush your teeth from left to right instead of right to left, you will still inadvertently involve the homunculus, controlling your behavior beyond scientific rules. Anyone faced with the question of limited free will knows that in the case of serious brain damage, a person cannot be held criminally responsible. If someone's frontal lobe is destroyed, they cannot be accountable for their actions, since their ability to make rational decisions is impaired. This is obvious, but questions arise when considering various degrees of damage. What if the frontal lobe is damaged by 99% or 98%? This question is critically important, as many individuals sentenced to death have a history of frontal lobe damage. Regardless where this boundary is drawn, proponents of free will agree that severe brain damage interferes with the homunculus work, while it can handle minor damage. Michio Gazzaniga proposed a rather unexpected twist. There is no free will, it's an illusion, but we are still responsible for our actions. He developed this thought in his bold book, Who's in Charge? Free Will and the Science of the Brain. Accepting the material nature of the brain unequivocally, Gazzaniga finds room for responsibility. Responsibility exists at a different level of organization, social, not at the level of our fully determined brain. His position can be summarized as, free will is an illusion, but for practical purposes, we will consider you responsible for your actions. Or he proposes the same homunculus, but existing only in a societal level. In his book, he elaborates on whether each individual bears personal responsibility for their actions. He explains how research on split brains discovered the interpretation module, making us believe that we act out on free will and make important decisions independently. Dr. Benjamin Libet's experiment, conducted in 1985, also cast doubt on the existence of free will. Participants were asked to watch a clock and precisely note the moment they decided to move their finger. EEG scans could accurately determine when the brain made this decision. However, comparing the results, a discrepancy between them is observed. The electroencephalogram showed that the brain makes a decision 300 milliseconds before the person becomes aware of it. This suggests that free will is a fiction. The brain makes a decision before consciousness kicks in and then tries to cover up this fact by claiming the decision was conscious. Dr. Michael Sweeney put it this way: Libet's results suggest that the brain knows what its owner will decide before the decision is made. We need to rethink not only the idea that movements can be voluntary and involuntary, but also the very notion of free will itself. Free will, a cornerstone of our society, appears to be a fiction, an illusion created by the left hemisphere of our brain. So are we truly masters of our own destiny, or just pawns in the brain's unfair game? David Deutsch, in his book The Fabric of Reality, writes, although we do not know what consciousness is, it's clearly closely related to the growth and representation of knowledge in the brain. Thus, it seems improbable that we will be able to explain what consciousness is as a physical process until we explain knowledge itself in terms of physics. Free will is somehow linked to another mental attitude, consciousness. It's well known that free will is also difficult to understand within the framework of the classical picture of the world. The difficulty of reconciling free will with physics is often attributed to determinism. But the culprit here is not determinism, but classical space-time. In space-time, something happens to me at each specific moment of my future. Even if what happens is unpredictable, it's already there, in the corresponding section of space-time. It doesn't make sense to say that I can change what's in this section. Space-time doesn't change, and therefore, within the physics of space-time, it's impossible to understand causes, effects, the openness of the future, or free will. Thus, replacing deterministic laws of motion with non-deterministic, random ones would not help solve the problem of free will, as long as these laws remain classical. Freedom has nothing to do with randomness. We value our free will as the ability to express in our actions who we are as individuals. Who would value randomness? What we consider our free will actions are not random or indeterminate actions, but those significantly defined by who we are and what we think.